December 23rd, 1944, 03:17 hours. Coordinates 50-45 N, 29-30 E. The air above the Dnieper hung thick with ash and the metallic tang of frozen blood. Snow fell not in flakes, but in greasy clumps that clung to eyelashes and rifle barrels like mourning veils. In the ruins of Kaniv, Ukraine, 17-year-old Mykola Hryshchenko crouched beneath his family's collapsed bakery, fingers numb around a rusted fire axe. The city hadn't seen bread in 83 days, only fire. Not the kind that baked loaves, but the slow, suffocating burn of phosphorus shells and oil drums rolled downhill by German sappers, clinging to bone and brick alike. Mykola wasn't a soldier. Too young, too slight, war took what it found, and it found a boy who carried water, chipping holes in the Dnieper's ice, dragging kettles through alleys littered with cartridges and frozen neighbors. That night, he noticed the silence. Not the absence of gunfire, that was luxury, but the absence of the Germans' clockwork artillery. Midnight. 3A. Am always on time, but after the 12 a.m. barrage, nothing. Mykola paused, breath pluming, ears straining past crackling embers. No Panzer engines, no barked orders from Hill 112, only wind whistling through a shattered tram. He crept toward the bell tower. From its rubble, he saw figures in SS green, not reloading but listening. One pressed a tubular device to the frozen earth. Another traced lines in a notebook. They avoided Sector Gamma, the eastern quarter, where old catacombs ran beneath St. Michael's Monastery. The same sector where a Soviet demolition team had vanished weeks earlier, leaving only a boot filled with ice. Mykola told Yevhen, the ex-railway engineer leading the cellar resistance. "They're mapping tunnels," he said. "They know we're using the catacombs." Yevhen snorted, stirring boiled beet scraps. "Boy, those tunnels collapsed in 38. Half are flooded. The Germans aren't digging for ghosts. They're waiting for us to starve." "But they're listening," Mykola insisted, "like they're tracking something underground." "Then let them listen," Yevhen muttered. "We've got no food, no ammo. If they want to hear rats squeak, let them." Dismissed, Mykola returned to his runs, but his mind churned. His father had taught him how sound traveled through ovens, through dough, through cold metal. Sound was vibration, and vibration moved through earth, stone, ice. On December 27th, he slipped into St. Michael's ruins. Behind the altar, he pried open the catacomb grate and descended into darkness smelling of limestone and incense. 50 meters in, he placed his ear to the wall. A faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. Every 12 seconds, not footsteps, too deep, like a heartbeat echoing through bedrock. Back in the cellar, he sketched it on charred paper. "It's not sound they're after," he told Yevhen. "It's resonance. Shells hit the surface, shock waves bounce off limestone, echo back up. The Germans use those echoes to map us, like bats." Yevhen stared. "You think Nazis are using church acoustics to hunt us?" "No," Mykola said. "They're using our silence against us. When we stop moving, echoes get clearer." That night, against orders, Mykola returned with a dented pot and copper wire. He struck the metal. The clang echoed, then multiplied. He tried softer. This time it died quickly. An idea formed. If sound could be dampened, the catacombs could go silent. Not empty, silent. He spent days experimenting in secret, lining walls with wet burlap, hanging mattress stuffing, filling cracks with ashen wax paste. By January 5th, when he struck the pot again, the sound vanished in 2 seconds. That night, Germans raided Sector Gamma. They advanced cautiously, ears tuned to devices. But the tunnels gave nothing back. Confused, they retreated at dawn, leaving 3 dead from booby traps. Word spread. Mykola's silencing worked, but Yevhen remained skeptical. "It's a parlor trick. They'll bring dogs next." Then came January 12th. A Soviet pilot crash-landed with urgent news. Kaniv would be relieved in 10 days. The Germans intercepted the message. That night, Hill 112 lit with flares. Reinforcements rolled in, flamethrowers, half-tracks, even a mobile sonar truck. The final assault was coming, and Mykola knew if the catacombs spoke, the city would fall. If they stayed silent, maybe, just maybe, they could hold until help arrived. He gathered every scrap of cloth, every willing hand. "We don't fight them," he told the haggard faces. "We disappear." And so, as snow began to fall again, the ghosts of Kaniv went to work, not with guns, but with silence. January 13th, 1945, 1844 hours. The temperature had dropped to -23°C, cold enough to freeze breath into shards before it left the lips. On Hill 112, Hauptmann Dieter Vogel adjusted the earpiece of his Schallotungswagen, the Wehrmacht's latest mobile acoustic detection unit, and frowned. The needle on the resonance meter barely twitched. For 3 nights now, the subterranean labyrinth beneath Kaniv had gone unnervingly still. No footfalls, no hammering of makeshift repairs, not even the telltale creak of a door hinge echoing through limestone. It was as if the city's underground had been swallowed by the earth itself. Vogel tapped the glass face of the instrument. "Impossible," he muttered in German. "The catacombs are extensive. They must be using them." His technician, a pale corporal named Lenz, shook his head. "Either they've abandoned Sector Gamma entirely, or they found a way to mute the acoustics," Vogel scoffed. "Peasants and bakers don't understand wave propagation," yet doubt gnawed at him. Intelligence reports confirmed Soviet partisans were still active. Sniper fire from the bell tower, booby-trapped supply caches, a half-track disabled by a mine disguised as a frozen loaf of bread. But the tunnels, once so rich with reverberations, now returned only silence. A silence so complete it felt deliberate. Unseen below, Mykola Hryshchenko knelt in the central chamber of the catacombs, his fingers pressing a strip of damp horsehair against a fissure in the wall. Around him, 20 volunteers worked in near-total darkness, their movements slow and deliberate to avoid noise. Every surface that could reflect sound, stone ledges, iron rungs, even the curved vaults of burial niches had been layered with insulation, quilted coats. Shredded mattress-ticking burlap soaked in a slurry of ash and rendered tallow. The air smelled of mildew and burnt wool, but the acoustics were dead. When Mykola dropped a pebble, it landed with a soft thud, absorbed instantly by the padded floor. He had no name for what he'd done, no scientific term, but he understood it the way a baker understands yeast, not through equations, but through feel, through listening. Sound, like dough, needed space to rise. Take away the air, the echo, the resonance, and it collapsed into nothing. Above ground, the Germans grew impatient. At Dreyfusar on January 14th, they unleashed a new tactic, seismic charges. Not high explosives meant to destroy, but low-frequency concussion devices designed to vibrate the earth and force hidden structures to sing. The first blast shook the catacombs like a struck gong. Dust rained from the ceiling. Mykola clapped his hands over his ears, teeth rattling, but the padding held. The resonance meter on Hill 112 spiked, then flatlined within seconds. Vogel stared at the readout, baffled. "It's like the energy just disappears." Lenz adjusted the gain. "There's no secondary reflection, no cavity resonance. It's as if the tunnels are lined with felt." "Felt?" Vogel snapped. "In a medieval crypt? Don't be absurd." Yet the evidence was undeniable. Over the next 48 hours, the Germans detonated 7 more seismic charges. Each time, the initial shockwave registered, but the telltale echoes that would reveal tunnel depth, branching paths, and occupancy vanished almost instantly. Frustration turned to suspicion. Was it sabotage? Soviet engineering? Or something else entirely? Back in the cellar beneath the post office, Yevhen finally relented. "All right, boy," he said, handing Mykola a rusted Mauser pistol, more symbol than weapon. "If your silence buys us time, then silence it is. But when the shooting starts, we fight." Mykola nodded. He wasn't a fighter, but he was a listener. And he knew the Germans would soon abandon acoustics for brute force. He was right. On January 17th at dawn, the sky over Kaniv filled with the drone of Junkers Ju-87 Stukas. Not bombs this time, incendiary oil drums filled with a viscous mixture of gasoline, tar, and white phosphorus. The plan was simple: burn the city clean. Force the partisans into the open or suffocate them underground. The first drum struck the monastery roof, exploding in a geyser of flame that clung to stone like living flesh. Within minutes, Sector Gamma was an inferno. Smoke poured into the catacombs through every crack and vent. Mykola and his team retreated deeper, dragging the wounded, sealing passages with rubble and wet blankets. The air grew thick, acrid. One man coughed until he vomited black phlegm. Another passed out from heat exhaustion, though it was still below freezing outside. But the fire had an unintended consequence. As the surface burned, the limestone above the catacombs expanded, then cracked under thermal stress. New fissures opened, some leading to forgotten chambers, others to the riverbank. Mykola, mapping the changes by touch and memory, realized they now had escape routes the Germans didn't know existed. More crucially, the fire masked all sound. The roar of flames drowned out footsteps, voices, even the clink of a canteen. The Germans, blinded by smoke and deafened by their own conflagration, assumed the resistance was either dead or fleeing. They halted the aerial assault at noon, convinced the job was done. That night, under cover of a blizzard, Mykola led a team through a newly exposed tunnel to the Dnieper's eastern bank. There they met a Soviet patrol, scouts from the 38th Army, advancing faster than expected. Mykola handed over a crude map of German positions, drawn from weeks of observation. "They're listening for echoes," he whispered. "But if you attack from the river, through the ice caves beneath the cliffs, they won't hear you coming. The rock there is solid granite, no resonance." The lieutenant, a hardened veteran named Sokolov, studied the boy's soot-streaked face. "You're the baker's son." Mykola nodded. Sokolov smiled grimly. "Then let's give them a recipe they won't forget." By January 20th, the Red Army had encircled Hill 112. Under Mykola's guidance, sappers planted shaped charges along the cliff face. Time to detonate during a diversionary artillery barrage. The explosions collapsed the German listening post into the river, burying Vogel's equipment and his doubts under 10 meters of ice and rubble. But the true test came 3 nights later. A captured German radio intercept revealed a final, desperate order: deploy Sonar Team Delta to Catacomb Entrance Alpha, confirm partisan presence before withdrawal. Mykola knew what that meant. If the Germans verified the tunnels were still occupied, they'd flood them with poison gas or collapse them entirely. There was no time for Red Army coordination. The decision had to be made now. He returned to the catacombs alone. At 01:30 on January 24th, 2 German engineers in rubberized suits descended the iron grate, Geiger counter-like devices in hand. Mykola watched from a side alcove, heart pounding. He had one chance. As the lead engineer stepped onto the padded floor, Mykola released a tripwire connected to a bucket of frozen mud suspended from the ceiling. The bucket tipped. A dull splat echoed, just enough to register on their instruments. The Germans froze. "Movement," one whispered. They advanced cautiously, sweeping their sensors. Mykola held his breath. The padding muffled his heartbeat, his breath, even the tremor in his hands. The Germans passed within 3 meters of him, their boots sinking silently into the insulated floor. Then, from the far end of the tunnel, Mykola triggered a second device, a string tied to a loose stone. It clattered down a shaft. "There!" the lead engineer hissed. "East corridor!" They rushed toward the sound, unaware it was a decoy. Minutes later, they reported back, confirmed. "Partisan activity in eastern catacombs. Recommend immediate fumigation." The order was given. At 04 Zau, canisters of chloropicrin were dropped into the vents. But Mykola had already sealed the eastern tunnels with rubble and redirected airflow through the new fissures. The gas pooled harmlessly in dead-end chambers, while the resistance sheltered in the western network, dry, silent, and safe. By dawn, the Germans began their retreat. The Red Army entered Kaniv on January 26th, finding a city of ash and ice, but alive. Of the 217 civilians who had endured the final siege, 189 survived. Not a single one had been captured in the catacombs. In the aftermath, Soviet engineers examined Mykola's insulation methods with astonishment. "This isn't fieldcraft," one murmured. "This is applied acoustics." They documented the layers, the materials, the geometry of sound absorption. Within weeks, similar techniques were being tested in Moscow for use in submarine hulls and command bunkers. But Mykola asked for nothing. When a commissar offered him a medal, he declined. "I just didn't want to be heard," he said simply, yet his silence had spoken louder than any explosion. February 3rd, 1945, 11:08 hours. The wind off the Dnieper carried the scent of thawing mud and charred timber as Colonel Arkady Vasilyev of Red Army Intelligence stepped through the skeletal remains of Kaniv's marketplace. His boots crunching over glass and frozen rye kernels spilled from a shattered grain sack. In his gloved hand, he held a dossier stamped Project Echo Null, a preliminary report compiled by acoustic engineers from the Kiev Polytechnic Institute, who had arrived 3 days after liberation to study what they called the Kaniv anomaly. Their findings defied doctrine. According to every textbook, a network of limestone tunnels beneath a shelled city should have been an acoustic nightmare, reverberant, echo-rich, impossible to silence. Yet field tests confirmed it. Sound decayed in the catacombs at a rate 97% faster than in untreated subterranean spaces. The Germans' sonar sweeps had registered nothing beyond surface noise. Vasilyev wasn't an acoustics expert. He was a pragmatist, and pragmatists recognize leverage when they see it. He found Mykola Hryshchenko not in a hospital or a barracks, but back in the ruins of his family's bakery, using a bent spoon to scrape mold off a sack of flour salvaged from beneath collapsed beams. The boy's hands were raw, his coat patched with burlap, but his eyes, sharp, watchful, missed nothing. "You understand what you've done?" Vasilyev asked, voice low. Mykola shrugged. "I kept us quiet." "You've given us a weapon," Vasilyev corrected. "Not a knife or a rifle. A silence that can hide armies," he explained. German U-boats in the Baltic were using hydrophones to detect Soviet convoys by the cavitation noise of propellers. In the Carpathians, Romanian mountain brigades were eavesdropping on partisan radio operators through seismic sensors buried in alpine rock. Even in Berlin, Gestapo interrogation cells were lined with resonant tiles to amplify whispers from adjacent rooms. Everywhere the enemy was listening, and everywhere Mykola's method offered a counter. But Mykola hesitated. "I didn't invent anything," he said. "I just listen better." Vasilyev smiled thinly. "In war, listening is the rarest skill of all." Within a week, Mykola was escorted to a requisitioned monastery outside Chernihiv, now repurposed as a Soviet acoustic research outpost. There, he met Dr. Irina Levchenko, a physicist who had once studied concert hall acoustics before the war turned her expertise toward survival. She listened to Mykola's descriptions, not of equations, but of textures, how wet wool swallowed high frequencies, how layered ash disrupted wave coherence, how curved surfaces scattered sound like pebbles in a stream. "You're describing impedance mismatching," she said, eyes alight. "You've created an acoustic metamaterial without knowing the term." She set up experiments in a mock catacomb chamber. Stone walls, vaulted ceiling, identical dimensions to St. Michael's. Mykola directed the placement of every scrap. Horsehair mats, oil-soaked rags, even shredded Soviet propaganda leaflets pasted in overlapping scales like fish skin. When they tested it with a calibrated speaker and hydrophone array, the results stunned the team. At 500 Hz, the frequency most sensitive to human movement and machinery, the echo duration dropped from 4.2 seconds to 0.11. "This isn't just dampening," Levchenko whispered. "It's erasure." Word reached Moscow. By March, a classified directive ordered the replication of Hryshchenko insulation in all forward command bunkers along the Vistula. But the real test came from the sea. In late April, a Soviet naval attaché arrived with urgent news. Convoy BD-17, carrying Lend-Lease tanks to Murmansk, had been decimated by U-968. The submarine hadn't fired torpedoes. It had simply shadowed the convoy for 3 days, reporting positions via encrypted radio bursts until Wolfpack reinforcements arrived. Post-mission analysis revealed the U-boat's hydrophones had detected the convoy at 38 kilometers, far beyond expected range. Why? Because the lead freighter, SS Kirovsk, had a cracked propeller shaft that created a distinctive harmonic resonance like a tuning fork in seawater. The Navy needed silence, not speed, not armor, silence. Mykola and Hryshchenko were flown to Kronstadt under blackout conditions. There, in a dry dock lit by flickering arc lamps, they faced the Kirovsk's massive bronze propeller, pitted, scarred, vibrating at 127 RPM, even at idle. Naval engineers insisted the only fix was replacement, a process requiring weeks. But Mykola ran his hand along the hull near the shaft housing and closed his eyes. "It's not the propeller," he said. "It's the hull." The vibrations traveling through the steel, amplifying in the cargo holds. He proposed an audacious solution, lined the interior bulkheads of the engine room and adjacent holds with layered insulation, rubberized canvas, cork sheets, and a slurry of asbestos and linseed oil, applied in staggered thicknesses to disrupt harmonic buildup. The engineers balked. That's not shipbuilding, it's upholstery. But Admiral Petrov, desperate, gave permission for a trial for 72 hours. Mykola worked alongside sailors, applying the composite by hand, testing each section with a tuning fork and a stethoscope borrowed from the infirmary. When the Kirovsk put to sea on May 2nd for convoy BD-19, hydrophone operators aboard escort destroyers reported something unprecedented. At 5 kilometers, the freighter's acoustic signature vanished. Not reduced, gone, as if the sea itself had swallowed it. U-968, lying in wait off Bear Island, detected nothing. The convoy passed unmolested. Of the 12 ships in BD-19, all reached Murmansk. 0 losses. Back in Kronstadt, Petrov summoned Mykola to his office. On the desk lay a Hero of Socialist Labor medal. "The state thanks you," the admiral said. Mykola looked at the gleaming star, then at his calloused hands. "I just didn't want the sea to hear us," he said quietly. Petrov nodded. "Then let the enemy keep listening. They'll hear only ghosts." By June, Hryshchenko lining was being applied to all Soviet Arctic convoys. German U-boat logs from July noted a disturbing trend. Convoys now exhibit intermittent acoustic dropout. Suspect new Allied stealth measures. In August, U-251 reported tracking a freighter for 6 hours, only for it to disappear from hydrophones as if submerged into another dimension. The crew, unnerved, broke off pursuit, but the innovation's reach extended beyond ships. In the forests of Belarus, partisan radio operators began wrapping their transmitters in layered felt and burying them in sand-filled crates, reducing detection range from 15 kilometers to under 500 meters. In besieged Budapest, Hungarian resistance fighters used Mykola's principles to soundproof safe houses, turning attics into silent command centers beneath the noses of SS patrols. Yet none of this reached the boy from Kaniv. He had returned to his ruined city by mid-May, not as a hero, but as a survivor. The bakery was gone. His parents were gone, but the river remained, and the silence he had learned to shape. One evening, as he sat on the bank, mending a fishing net, an old woman approached, Madame Zoriana, who had once bought rye loaves from his father. She placed a small icon in his palm, St. Nicholas, patron of sailors and the falsely accused. "They say you made the city disappear," she murmured. Mykola shook his head. "I just helped it stop talking," she smiled. "Sometimes the loudest act is to say nothing at all. In Moscow, Hryshchenko published a classified paper titled Passive Acoustic Cloaking in Urban and Maritime Environments, citing field observations from civilian sources. The military adopted the techniques, but the origin remained obscured, partly for security, partly because institutions rarely credit Baker's sons. Still, the effect was undeniable. By war's end, German acoustic intelligence units reported a 73% drop in reliable subterranean and maritime detections. On the Eastern Front, entire operations had been conducted in what one Wehrmacht officer called a vacuum of sound. Mykola never saw those statistics. He never sought them. He rebuilt a lean-to beside the Dnieper, traded fish for flour and baked bread again, small, dense loaves shared with orphans and widows. When asked how he survived the 100 nights of fire, he'd simply say, "I learned to listen to the quiet," and in that quiet, a truth echoed, that innovation rarely arrives with fanfare. It slips in through cracks, wrapped in burlap, whispered by those the world assumes have nothing to say. September 12, 1945, 07:33 hours. The morning mist clung to the Dnieper like a shroud as Mykola Hryshchenko knelt in the skeletal frame of what had once been Kaniv's central market, sifting through rubble with bare hands. Autumn had come early, and with it the first rains that turned ash into slurry and memory into mud. He wasn't searching for relics, those were gone, melted or buried, but for nails. Bent, rusted, useless to most, but precious to a man rebuilding a roof one splinter at a time. His fingers brushed something cold and smooth, a porcelain doll's eye. Half buried, its blue iris clouded with grime. He tucked it into his pocket, not for sentiment, but because glass reflected light, and light could signal across the river when radios failed. He didn't know it yet, but that small act, preserving the useless, would echo far beyond the banks of the Dnieper. 3 weeks earlier, a letter had arrived from Moscow, delivered by a Red Army courier on a dented motorcycle. It bore no insignia, only a typed request. "Citizen Hryshchenko, your presence is requested at the Central Acoustics Directorate for consultation on post-war reconstruction." Mykola had burned it in his stove. He had no desire to return to laboratories, to men in clean coats who spoke of applications and scalability. His war was over. His city was not. Yet the world had other plans. Unbeknownst to him, Dr. Irina Levchenko had been summoned to Potsdam in August as part of a Soviet scientific delegation observing the Allied occupation. There, during a tense exchange with British naval engineers, she mentioned, casually, almost offhand, the Kaniv method of acoustic dampening. The British, reeling from U-boat losses in the Atlantic even after Germany's surrender, listened intently. One officer, Commander Alistair Finch, of the Royal Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division, pressed her for details. Levchenko demurred. It was a field improvisation, not reproducible in standard engineering, but Finch wasn't convinced. Back in Portsmouth, he tasked a junior acoustician, Eleanor Price, with scouring captured German naval logs for anomalies in hydrophone performance during 1944-45. What she found stunned him. Between March and May 1945, Soviet convoys in the Barents Sea exhibited a sudden, inexplicable drop in detectability. German U-boat captains described phantom silences, acoustic voids, and ships that walked on water without sound. One log from U-481 read, "Target vanished at 4.2 kilometers, no engine failure, no dive." As if erased by the sea, Finch filed a top-secret report. Evidence suggests Soviet deployment of passive acoustic cloaking. Origin unknown. Recommend immediate counter-research. Meanwhile, in Kaniv, Mykola's silence was being tested anew, not by shells, but by suspicion. In late October, 2 men in long coats arrived from the NKVD. They didn't wear uniforms, but their boots were too clean for farmers, their eyes too still for travelers. They found Mykola repairing a fishing weir downstream. "Citizen Hryshchenko," the taller one said, voice flat. "You refused the state's invitation." Mykola kept working, fingers knotting reeds. "I'm needed here." The state decides where you're needed. They escorted him not to Moscow, but to a newly established facility near Kharkiv, Camp 17, a repurposed Luftwaffe radar station, now housing the Soviet Union's most sensitive acoustic research. Inside a concrete bunker lined with cork and steel mesh, Hryshchenko waited, her face drawn, her hands trembling slightly. "They're calling it Project Stillwater," she whispered as they walked past humming oscilloscopes and banks of reel-to-reel recorders. "They want to scale your method for submarines, for command centers, for everything." Mykola stopped. "It won't work." "Why not?" "Because it wasn't science," he said. "It was listening. You can't mass-produce attention." But the state had already decided. Over the next 6 weeks, Mykola was made to supervise teams of engineers as they applied his layered insulation to the hull of a captured German Type 7IC U-boat, now rechristened B-26. They used synthetic rubber, industrial felt, even experimental polymers developed in Leningrad labs. The results were inconsistent. Sometimes the echo dropped. Often it worsened. New materials created their own resonances, humming at frequencies that betrayed the sub's presence more clearly than bare steel. Frustration mounted. One night, after a failed test in which the B-26's acoustic signature spiked during a routine dive, a senior engineer slammed his fist on a console. "This boy's folk magic is wasting our time." Mykola said nothing, but the next morning, he walked to the dry dock alone. He ran his palm along the submarine's conning tower, then the ballast tanks, then the propeller shaft. He closed his eyes, listened. "It's not the lining," he told Hryshchenko later. "It's the seams. Every bolt, every weld, they're ringing like bells. You're covering the skin, but the bones are still singing." He proposed a radical fix, not just surface insulation, but structural decoupling. Isolate the engine mounts with rubber gaskets. Wrap every pipe in layered cloth soaked in tar. Even line the crew's bunks with horsehair to muffle movement. The engineers scoffed, too labor-intensive, too primitive. But Hryshchenko, remembering the catacombs, overruled them. On December 3, 1945, the B-26 slipped beneath the ice-choked waters of the Sea of Azov. Hydrophone buoys tracked it from shore. At 200 meters, its signature dropped below ambient ocean noise. At 500 meters, it disappeared entirely. For the first time in naval history, a submerged vessel had achieved true acoustic invisibility, not through speed or depth, but through silence. The success was classified at the highest level. Within months, the design principles were incorporated into the new Project 611, Soviet Zulu-class submarines, the first to feature Hryshchenko dampening as standard. By 1948, NATO intelligence noted a disturbing trend. Soviet subs were ghosting sonar nets in the North Atlantic, slipping past detection with eerie consistency. The U.S. Navy launched Project Artemis in response, pouring millions into passive sonar upgrades. The Cold War's silent duel had begun, not with missiles, but with the absence of sound. Back in Kaniv, Mykola was released in January 1946, given a modest pension and a citation for patriotic contribution to defensive science. No fanfare, no parade. Just a train ticket and a warning. Speak of Camp 17 and you vanish. He returned to his lean-to, to his bread, to his river. But the world followed him in whispers. In 1947, a French journalist tracking post-war reconstruction in Ukraine heard rumors of the boy who silenced a city. He sought Mykola out, notebook in hand. "Why didn't you stay in Moscow?" the journalist asked. "You could have been famous." Mykola needed dough, his movements rhythmic, calm. "Fame is noise," he said, "and noise gets you killed." The journalist left with only a loaf of bread and a story he was told never to publish. Yet the legacy spread. In 1950, British engineers working on the HMS Explorer, an experimental high-speed submarine, discovered that lining the engine room with layered cork and rubber reduced cavitation noise by 40%. Their report cited unverified Eastern European field methods. In 1953, the U.S. Navy's Tang-class subs adopted similar anechoic tiling, though designers claimed it was an independent innovation. Only Levchenko knew the truth. In her private journals, now archived in the Russian State Military Museum, she wrote, "All great silences begin with one person who dares to stop talking and start listening." Mykola never read those words. He never needed to. Each spring, as the ice broke on the Dnieper, he would walk to the ruins of St. Michael's Monastery and place a single candle in the catacomb entrance, not for the dead, but for the quiet that had saved them. Children would ask what it meant. "It means," he'd say, "that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is make no sound at all." And in that silence, empires trembled. March 18, 1985, 14:22 hours. The Dnieper flowed wide and slow beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a carp rising to feed. On the eastern bank, near the overgrown path that once led to the Hryshchenko bakery, an old man sat on a folding stool, mending a fishing net with fingers gnarled by arthritis, but still precise, still sure. Mykola was 77 now, his hair white as river foam, his back bent like a willow branch under snow. Tourists sometimes mistook him for a local eccentric, just another relic of a war they'd read about in textbooks. None knew that the quiet man with the patched coat had once made a city vanish. A young engineer from Kiev, sent by the Ministry of Defense to document historical acoustic sites, approached hesitantly. He carried a digital recorder and a folder stamped with the red star of a program long since renamed but never abandoned. Project Stillwater. Legacy Assessment. "Mr. Hryshchenko?" the man asked, voice respectful but edged with academic impatience. "I'm from the Acoustics Institute. We're compiling oral histories of wartime innovations." Mykola didn't look up. "I didn't innovate. I survived, but your method wasn't mine," Mykola interrupted, tying off a knot with his teeth. "It belonged to the city, to the stone, the ash, the silence between bombs," the engineer persisted. "Modern stealth submarines still use principles derived from your work. The Americans call it acoustic signature reduction. We call it... well, we don't call it anything. It's just standard now." Mykola finally met his gaze. His eyes, pale blue and clouded at the edges, held no pride, only a deep, weathered weariness. "Then you've forgotten the lesson." "What lesson?" "That silence isn't a weapon," Mykola said softly. "It's a refuge. You turn it into a weapon, and soon everyone's listening for it. And when everyone's listening, no one hears the truth anymore." He stood stiffly and gestured toward the river. "In 45, I thought I'd given you a tool. But tools become traps when you stop asking why you need them." The engineer left an hour later with only a cup of weak tea and a single sentence recorded. "The loudest thing in war is the sound of people refusing to listen." That night, snow began to fall. Not the greasy, ash-laden flakes of 1944, but clean, quiet snow that hushed the world as it settled. Mykola sat by his stove, the porcelain doll's eye on the windowsill catching the firelight. He thought of his brother taken by the SS, of Yevon, who died in the final days of the siege, clutching a map drawn in beet juice, of the children who'd shared his bread and never knew why the bombs stopped falling. He had never sought recognition. No medals hung on his wall. No plaques marked the catacombs. Yet his legacy pulsed in every quiet corridor of modern warfare, in the rubber-coated hulls of nuclear submarines gliding beneath Arctic ice, in the sound-dampened cockpits of stealth aircraft, in the padded walls of secure communication rooms, where generals whisper strategies that shape nations. Even civilian life bore his imprint. Concert halls now used layered baffles, inspired by his burlap and ash composites. Recording studios employed Hryshchenko grids to eliminate echo, but none of it mattered to him. What mattered was that for 100 nights, people had lived because the world couldn't hear them. On April 2, 1985, Mykola failed to appear at the riverside. Neighbors found him in his sleep, one hand resting on a half-kneaded loaf of dough, the other holding a rusted fire axe, its edge dulled, its handle worn smooth by time. His funeral was small. A priest, 3 widows from the siege, a retired naval officer who'd served on the B-26, and the young engineer from Kiev. No state delegation, no fanfare. Just the wind through the willows and the distant murmur of the Dnieper. They buried him on a hill overlooking the river, near the ruins of St. Michael's. No headstone bore his name, only a simple cross, and carved into the base by a local stonemason who'd once received a loaf during the famine. A single word in Cyrillic, Sluchov. He listened. Decades later, declassified NATO files would confirm what historians had long suspected. The turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just radar or code breaking, it was silence. Soviet convoys, protected by Hryshchenko's method, delivered 1,200 tanks, 800 aircraft, and 400,000 tons of supplies to the Eastern Front in early 1945, enabling the final offensives that crushed Army Group Center. German U-boat losses spiked, not because they were hunted more effectively, but because they could no longer hear their prey. By May 1945, U-boat Command reported a 92% drop in successful convoy interceptions in the Barents Sea. The sea, once their ally, had gone mute, yet Mykola's true impact lay not in statistics, but in a quiet inversion of power. He proved that observation, keen, patient, uncredentialed, could outmaneuver doctrine. That a baker's son, armed with nothing but attention and scraps, could blind an empire's ears. In an age that glorified the loud, the fast, the explosive, he chose the opposite: stillness, slowness, absorption. Today, the catacombs of Kaniv are a museum. Tour guides point to the padded walls and speak of Soviet acoustic ingenuity. Few mention the boy who noticed the silence between the bombs. But if you stand very still in Chamber 3 on a cold winter night and press your ear to the stone where the burlap once hung, you might hear it. Not an echo, but the absence of one. A perfect, deliberate quiet, and in that silence a truth endures, that the most revolutionary acts are often the quietest. That innovation doesn't always roar, it sometimes whispers from the shadows, wrapped in horsehair and hope, waiting for someone to listen. Mykola Hryshchenko never wanted to be remembered. He only wanted his city to survive, and in the end it did, because one boy dared to make no sound at all.